Lucia shoved the stall flap aside and found the oven stone still dark and cool. Under the ash there was no heat. And a line of neighbors pressed forward with hollowed cheeks and clenched hands. Suspicion tightened in her chest when she saw the baker's hands empty. Then she counted the small rounds on the table and felt the difference with her fingers. The oven's out, the baker said, voice flat and quick, and people around him murmured the same worry she already held. Within those first small moments, Lucia understood the problem. The neighborhood's daily bread supply had shrunk, and someone would have to decide how to meet the need. Lucia wiped flour from her palms and set the basket against her hip. She had no time for slow thinking. She moved through the cluster of bodies and names. Lucia, a woman called, voice Thimmy Boy. The morning filled with short lines and quick motions. Lucia, wait by the arch. I'll speak with Marcus on the roof. Her voice stayed low. She tied the linen wrap tighter. People watched the exchange. The city smelled of cold stone and old soot. She climbed the narrow stair toward the shared roof. Every step brought the day's numbers into her head. She thought of her household, a small oven, the baker who left the stall to fetch wood, the small clay cups used for oil. Suspicion, then urgency, guided her feet. She needed to know if this was mere shortage or something worse. Marcus was on the roof before the sun. He sat with his legs folded and a single coin in his palm, tapping the edge with his thumb. He looked up when she reached the parapet. Morning, Lucia, he said, and his nod held awareness that matched the coin. Lucia did not answer with words at once. She opened her basket and showed him the thin loaves she had taken from the baker's stall. They're smaller. She said, the oven is cold. How much did you earn? Marcus counted the coin again and set it on his knee. 4 asses, he said. He tapped them once more. 4. He looked at the rooftops, and then at the stairs. Not enough for more flour this month. His hand sketched a small circle in the air, showing how little room there was to change things. Elias joined them at the lip of the roof, fingers folded over his thin shawl. He leaned on his walking stick and listened before he spoke. I saw a man with sacks near the storeroom last night, he said. His voice was a careful cadence, and the sentence landed as a new fact among the measured numbers. Lucia felt her chest tighten again. Suspicion hardened into doubt. What man? Marcus. He straightened so quickly the wool cap slipped. He spoke with fewer words now, each one sharp and necessary. A tax official. A thief. Elias tapped the cup in his hand. He didn't know his title. He wore a heavier cloak. He left with 2 men. They went toward the eastern arch. He folded his fingers and kept them still. The storeroom door was latched this morning but not sealed. A neighbor said grain was gone, and his eyes found Lucia's face and waited for her to decide what to do with that news. They spoke in short bursts. The roof smelled of hearth smoke and damp cord. Lucia's fingers tightened on the wicker of her basket. She felt a shift from suspicion into a pressing need to act. She could not let the rumor stand without proof. Should look under the arch tonight, she said. Her sentence carried the movement from worry to planning. Marcus stood. Will be seen, he said. If it is the magistrate, there will be trouble. He folded his hands behind his back, counting possibilities with the crease of his thumb. His caution showed in the set of his mouth. If it is a neighbor, Lucia, cut in. If it is a neighbor, we must know before we accuse. If it is the taxman, there are other ways to answer. She smoothed her apron with both hands, a motion that kept her steady. We'll watch the arch tonight. Marcus, help me check the storeroom. Elias, watch the stairs. If you hear anything, knock twice on the iron ring and call my name. She looked at them all. Will not accuse without proof. We will not leave the children hungry. Her voice was small and shaped like a command. Elias nodded. He put the clay cup down on the low wall and pressed his fingers against it as if to memorize the weight. I will listen. But I warn you, Lucia, there are consequences if we are caught. The warning rested between them like another small object to be moved. That afternoon moved with a careful, grinding rhythm. Lucia walked the corridors, checked the stairwell, and exchanged quick words with neighbors who came and went. Each encounter delivered small pieces: a child's cough, a woman's tightened purse, a man passing with a sack that seemed lighter than it should be. The pantry in the archway became a focus. A merchant had once used it for olive oil jars. Now it held sacks stacked without labels. Each sack told nothing unless touched. At dusk the archway smelled faintly of oil. Lucia and Marcus lingered near the entrance, pretending to look for spare pottery, feeling the building's breaths and listening for the footfalls that might belong to thieves or officials. Marcus kept his hand near his frayed belt. He counted his coins again. The motion calmed him. Lucia watched the lock on the storeroom as the light dimmed. They left the arch and returned to the rooftop, where Elias sat with his cup and a folded shawl. The sky was a thin ribbon of color. Lucia could see the outlines of other roofs, chimneys, and the slant of the city. Conversation there took the shape of small, urgent exchanges. A child left a print by the door. One neighbor offered when she approached a child's footprint. Small and round, he shrugged and looked away. Lucia's stomach went tight. She'd describe it. Where exactly? The neighbor pointed. Beside the broken clay pot at the base. It was dusty but definite. It looked like a sandal or a small foot. There was a chip of a cup nearby. The neighbor smiled weakly, trying to make the fact lighter than it seemed. Lucia and Marcus exchanged a quick glance. Marcus tapped his thumb against his index finger and then fell silent. The doubt that had been nagging both of them turned now toward confusion. A child leaving a print undermined the idea of official seizure and suggested someone close to the building. The shift pulled their suspicion in a new direction. Perhaps a neighbor, perhaps an act of quiet barter. They planned to check the storeroom that night. Lucia wrapped her head in the linen and took only what she needed. Marcus strapped his tool pouch closer and tucked his cap lower. Their actions were precise and quiet. Elias walked with them to the stair landing, 2 steps behind, keeping his hand near the wooden stick. Night arrived as a thick, stilled thing. The archway lay in shadow. Lucia's feet made no sound on the stones. The storeroom door hung slightly open. The two of them slipped inside. The sacks smelled of straw and old grain. They moved lamps low and the light traced the edges of sacks and clay jars. Lucia crouched and ran a palm along the floor. She found the imprint of a small sandal where the dust had been broken. The outline was clear. Nearby, half hidden beneath a sack, lay a chipped clay cup with a hairline crack. Her fingers felt the cup's rim. It was not polished like an official store item. It was a child's cup from someone who drank at a neighbor's hearth. Marcus glanced at the cup, and then at Lucia. "This cup belongs to no official," he said. He pulled a small strand of straw free from the sack and held it between thumb and forefinger. "It smells of rosemary. Someone offered grain to a sick child, perhaps. Or someone took it to a child nearby." His voice dropped, the urgency reshaping into a different kind of H. Lucia stood and leaned her head against the storeroom wall. She took a breath that came with a new angle of the problem. They had expected a thief or a heavy cloak. Instead, evidence pointed toward a small household, a child, and a set of choices made in the dark. Doubt shifted to a quiet grief that tugged at what they would do next. They left with the cup wrapped in a scrap of linen. They moved back to the rooftop under a sky that had lost its thin ribbon and become darker and more difficult to read. Elias waited, his fingers working the cup in his pocket as if wondering whether to speak. The neighbors clustered with faces pulled by lack of sleep. When Lucia held the cup up under the skylight, he said nothing at first. He looked at the chip, at the hairline crack, and then at the faces around him. "Who did this belong to?" he asked. His question was a small knife of curiosity. A heated exchange began, quick and raw. Marcus spoke first. "Elias, you said you saw sacks taken. Did you trade? Did you move grain?" His words were short and rapid, pushed out in a line. Elias' hands trembled slightly as he folded his shawl. "He told the truth about the man by the storeroom, Marcus. I swore it. Why do you ask me such a thing?" He kept his voice thin, trying to keep control. Lucia stepped forward and said, "Elias, did you give grain to someone? Did you take any to sell?" Her sentence landed between them and stopped the others from speaking. "Marcus, we found a child's print in a small cup. Someone moved a small amount. If you did, why would you not tell us?" Elias' face changed, his jaw worked. He folded his hands on his walking stick and rested his chin there. "I took a cup once to my neighbor's sick boy. He said slowly, would not wake for days. I had a small pouch. I traded 2 measures of grain for bread. I kept nothing for trade. I lit a candle and walked away before dawn. I did not sell to anyone. I only tried to help." His voice thinned and then steadied. The rooftop became a place of rapid exchange. Neighbors' short, sharp questions. "Lucia, Elias, why did you not tell us? You could have asked. We would have found a way." Her hands smoothed the linen of her skirt. The words were not accusing. They pushed at the old man's choices. Marcus answered with impatience, "Elias, if you hid grain, you may have harmed us. A neighbor could have more than they should. We must be clear." He paced a small circle and then stopped, meeting Elias' eyes. Elias' voice dropped into a whispery, papery tone. "I gave 2 measures to a boy who would not wake. I traded a small jar of oil. I thought it right. I told no one because the boy's family feared shame. I thought it kinder to hide the truth." His fingers tapped the cup. "If I did wrong, I will accept it. But I will not take blame for kindness." The argument shifted the neighborhood's feelings in a single turn. People who had been ready to shout or to point now looked at the old man and then at their own hands. Lucia's chest loosened and then tightened in a new way. The initial suspicion that someone had stolen for profit had turned into the harder problem of secret charity and withheld truth. The emotion moved again from suspicion to urgency, then from doubt to a mix of anger and compassion. Neighbors began to speak in fragments of dialogue, short and direct. "The lied, he gave it away, why hide it?" The back and forth went 3, 4, 5 turns. Lucia let them speak and then guided them. "Cannot banish him. We must redistribute what remains tonight and bake what we can. We do it because the child needs bread." Her decision made a new motion. Marcus helped plan the night baking. He tapped his thumb against the palm and counted in quick lines. "He will use the last flour sacks and bake small loaves through the night. Lucia will haul water. Elias, you will watch the stairs. I will mend the oven door and empty the ashes." Sentences were short commands that fit the work. Elias nodded and folded his hands. "He will watch, and I will tell no more lies. If you wish to punish me, do so with work, not whispers." He lowered his chin and turned to the group. "Give the child what you have. If I must go uncompensated, I will go." They worked in measured bursts. Lucia hummed quietly while kneading. The melody kept the rhythm. Marcus wiped soot from the oven stones and moved a cracked tile to shift the airflow. Elias carried small cups of water for those who needed a drink. Every action showed how the group shifted from confrontation to an uneasy cooperation. They argued and then used the argument to decide who would do what. When the oven warmed and the first thin loaves slid from the hearth, the smell reached each person like an honest announcement. They broke bread at dawn on the roof. Lucia dipped a torn corner into a shallow bowl of olive oil and handed it to a child with mud on his knee. Marcus poured a small measure of warm water into clay cups. Elias leaned on his stick and watched them eat. The mood held a tempered relief. Voices were quieter. People short stories about earlier rains and where they had once stored oil jars. The rooftop conversation slowed into low, easy exchanges. Yet an unease remained under the talk. The market still creaked, the city still took its due, and the underlying scarcity had not been solved. Lucia looked at Marcus and then at Elias. She held the last small loaf and handed it to the neighbor whose child had coughed through the night. The motion sealed their pact. Marcus kissed his calloused thumb and touched it to the bread in a small, private gesture. Elias raised his clay cup and then set it down with a careful hand. The chapter closed with a quiet, specific act. Lucia stepped to the roof edge and tied a tiny scrap of cloth to the iron ring, the mark they used to signal watchfulness, and called up the names of those who would take turns checking the arch. The sun took the rim of the rooftops and cut a pale line along the city. They had arranged a fragile plan. It would hold for a little while. Lucia walked down the stair with the basket balanced against her hip, and the weight of the night's decisions pressed into the motion of her feet. Marcus vaulted the low parapet and reached the flat roof just as the clerk shoved a sack toward the attendant stop. Marcus barked, and his voice cut across the courtyard as the men froze with rope creaking in their hands. The ledger of the neighborhood was not a thing Marcus usually named, but tonight his suspicion drove him forward. He could not accept that grain meant to feed the insulae left without reason. The roof smelled of cooled clay, soot, and the thin tang of last week's oil. Marcus let those smells ground him while he watched the clerk, Gaius, signal the attendants to hurry. Marcus did not wait for answers. He stepped between the sacks and the nearest attendant. Gaius, he said, naming the clerk so the rooftop would hear who was being accused. Whose orders are these? The attendant shifted his weight and tightened his fingers on the rope. Marcus felt a local anger rise that began as sharp suspicion and turned his hands into fists. His voice held a single steady note that came from years of being counted out of public favors. Lucia reached the stair landing with an empty basket and saw Marcus blocking the path. She paused, felt the old unease from the cold oven that morning, and moved forward. Lucia's first thought was bread. Her second was the ledger. Marcus did not yet know he would need Lucia. Marcus, and hearing her name steadied him. The rooftop was crowded with neighbors pressed against low chimneys and tiled ridges. They watched the clerk with a mix of hope and alarm. Gaius did not answer directly. He stepped back and held his chin as if measuring his words. City orders. He said, "We take what's designated for redistribution." Marcus heard the phrase and felt the emotion shift from suspicion to disbelief. He could not reconcile the clerk's calm with the sight of sacks stamped for shipment to private villas. Marcus, city orders to whom? And the two attendants shifted the sacks again like men already rehearsed for a refusal. Lucia moved closer so her hands brushed Marcus' sleeve. She smelled of yeast and faint olive. She kept her voice low and practical. "Gaius, Lucia, there are children waiting at the baker's door." There was no heat this morning. The crowd shifted. Marcus felt the mood tilt. Disbelief shifted into sharp worry. Lucia's words pulled the morning's cold oven into the present, tying what the baker had failed to the sacks on the rooftop. The clerk's eyes flicked toward the courtyard, and he named no names. Orders. He repeated from the storeroom registry. Marcus took that as an opening and pressed. He stepped up, so his chest was level with the ledger. The clerk did not yet show who wrote the registry. Marcus. His jaw tightened. The emotion that had begun as suspicion pushed him to demand proof rather than plead. He wanted a ledger. He wanted paper that could be read aloud on the rooftop, so the neighbors could hear who had taken their grain. Elias came up behind Marcus with the slow step of a man who had watched rooftops for years. He caught Lucia's eye and set his cup down on the tile. There was an old arrangement, Elias, fingers knitting the wool of his shawl. He spoke the name of a granary by a canal that used to list distributed shipments. The granary had a ledger. Elias continued. It held who received how much. Marcus felt a new swell of purpose. The emotion shifted again. Worry smoothed into a plan. Elias' memory moved them from accusation into action. Lucia's face folded into a quiet calculation. She had stood at the cool oven that morning and counted loaves with a hand that trembled at the wrist. She smelled flour on her palms now and set the empty basket down so she could use both hands to climb down faster. "We fetch the ledger, Lucia." Her voice had no flourish, only an insistence born of hunger and of habit. Marcus nodded, and the three of them formed a tight line across the tiles, neighbors parting to give them a path. They left the rooftop under a thin dusk. Light from courtyard lamps pooled on the cobbles below. Marcus kept his shoulders low and walked with the cautious step of a man who had carried heavy stone all morning and did not want to hear the creak of something alarming. Lucia shadowed him, clutching her head wrap. Elias lagged a pace behind, holding his cup and listening for the clack of merchant boots on the alley flagstones. Each step felt tactical. At the warehouse, a lantern burned behind barred windows. Marcus knocked the door hard enough that the clank carried down the alley. A guard opened a slit and peered out, eyes narrowed. "Who must speak with the manager," Marcus plainly. The guard pushed the bolt and did not let them enter. "He manager busy with records. No one may enter." Marcus counted the words and felt the pressure sharpen again. Refusal converted the plan into a covert action. Lucia stepped toward a side door and pressed her palm against warm, recent wood. She listened for voices beyond and felt breath condense on the rough grain. Lucia tilted her head and could make out the murmur of men by a lamp. "Marcus, there is light inside," she whispered. Marcus put his ear near the side door and heard a soft scraping of a stylus across pages and the low thud of sacks being moved. He tapped the lintel and felt that small metallic echo like a promise. A moment later, a guard turned a corner and caught Marcus' eye. The man assumed Marcus meant to bargain. Marcus raised his hands in plain gesture of civility and said, "We only need to know why sacks leave for villas when the bakery had no fire this morning." The guard flatly said, "Orders." No questions. Marcus felt his chest tighten. The group could either retreat and allow the sacks to leave or find a way in. Marcus looked at Lucia and she answered with motion. She slid a length of cord from her basket and used it to hook the latch with the practiced hand of someone who had mended oven flaps. They moved inside on breath and shadow. The storeroom smelled of barley, olive brine, and damp burlap. Marcus' eyes adjusted to lamplight. He saw a row of packed sacks and, offset beneath a pallet, a burlap bundle that held something flat and rectangular. Lucia crouched and lifted a corner of the cloth. Marcus' hand met hers over the object, and they separated the burlap to reveal a ledger bound in oiled leather and marked with a merchant's seal. Lucia opened the ledger with a cautious thumb. Pages had neat columns and names written in a formal hand. Marcus leaned in. He read aloud a name and a number: to Villa of Cassius, Marcus, counting the circulated measure. The voice in his chest jumped from determination to incredulous anger. The ledger showed redirected shipments and signatures from men known to them by sight. Lucia read a line and said, "Look, our district," crossed out and signed over. Her fingers tightened on the page until the tip of her nail blanched. Footsteps sounded near the doorway. Marcus snapped the ledger shut and motioned Lucia back. The guard at the threshold had returned, his shadow long across the floor. Marcus pressed his shoulder against the stacked sacks and braced. The man at the door called, "Who goes in my storeroom?" Marcus felt the air compress into immediate risk. The group's mood collapsed into urgent fear. They had been discovered. Marcus shoved a sack to block the doorway and moved to the light. He lifted his chin and spoke with a clarity that came from a dazed "Le boy, our neighbors. Marcus, you are here because the bakery gave no fire this morning. We ask only to know where our grain has gone." The guard laughed, and the sound rolled off the stone. "Neighbors, do not break in," he said. The guard reached for a club. Lucia gripped the ledger and pulled it close to her chest. Her hands were sticky from duff and olive oil. She held the book like a child clutches a shirt. "Do not touch him." Lucia sharply to the guard, "Oh, not touch Marcus." Marcus saw the guard's jaw set and readied for a push. The guard stepped forward. Marcus shoved past the first motion and the guard moved to meet him. The struggle began in a small confined space. Marcus shoved a shoulder against the guard and knocked the man's footing. The guard staggered and caught himself on the workbench. Lucia, clutching the ledger, moved to the lamp and knocked it like a weapon so its oil slumped and sputtered. Light caught the guard's face and then flared. A sack toppled and spilled grain across the floor. Marcus ducked and felt a glancing blow to his forearm. The scuffle was physical, fragrant, and immediate. Marcus shoved the guard again, and this time the man swore the name of his captain. The guard reached for the bell rope by the door and began to sound alarm. Marcus felt the room tilt into danger and reacted with a quick reach. He pushed the guard aside and grabbed Lucia's arm. He hissed. They darted through a side corridor with sacks bumping their shoulders. Marcus felt a sting along his palm, where a splinter caught, and thought only to keep moving. They spilled out into the alley with the ledger clutched under Lucia's arm. Marcus glanced back and saw the warehouse door burst open. A guard shouted and men spilled into the street. Elias waited on the roof line and slid down a ladder, his shawl snagging once and then releasing. He reached Marcus and felt his pulse through the thin wool of Marcus, sleeve of the ledger. Elias. Breath quick we have it. Marcus leaned on the old man's shoulder for a single steadying moment. Their fear shifted again. Immediate danger eased into raw relief and a new problem, possession. Back on their rooftop, they sat in a semicircle under a single oil lamp. Marcus wiped his hand on his tunic and counted coins by thumb to measure his small wounds. Lucia opened the ledger and pointed to name. See here, Lucia's name is a villa near the Forum. That name is Senator Octavian Steward. Marcus read aloud the numbers and found that his own district's ration had been reduced and reassigned. Reading the ledger changed their fear into a fierce clarity. The theft was not accidental. Neighbors in dark windows leaned forward when they heard the names. A small woman called down from the next stair who named them. Lucia read the signature again, and the handwriting matched a seal Marcus had seen on official dispatches. Marcus felt a muscle tighten at his temple and spoke with slow force. She will not confront the clerk on rumor. He said, we have this paper. We will bring it where it matters. His voice suggested action, not revenge. Elias folded his hands and tapped the ledger with knuckle. Paper is proof, but proof is two things, witness and timing. He took a slow breath and counted the names aloud. Tell trusted neighbors first. Elias gather witnesses who saw Sachs leave. Then we go together to the granary or the magistrate's office. Marcus agreed. The three of them planned, with a careful rhythm born of years in cramped rooms where hasty choices ruined more than they saved. Lucius split a small loaf they had snatched from a neighbor's shelf and handed pieces around. The bread was warm at the center and soot dark on the crust. Marcus bit and felt salt and a comforting crumb. The act of sharing steadied each of them more than words could. They mapped faces to columns in the ledger and assigned neighbors who would speak truthfully about oven mornings and empty tables. That night they organized in quiet turns. Lucia would speak with the women who collected for the infants. Marcus would go to the dock workers who saw carts leave. Elias would call the two men who had once worked in the granary and remembered who signed receipts. Each choice felt like a stone placed to bridge fear into something that could be presented. The emotion at their center moved from fear to calculated resolve. Marcus could still feel the graze on his hand where the guard's fist had hit him. He pressed on it with his thumb and watched a thin film of blood gather. The wound hurt but did not slow his thinking. He wrapped the hand in a strip of cloth as Elias poured a little warm water into his cup and held it near the flame. You gave me the ledger. Lucia. Almost to herself. Marcus nodded. He had taken a risk and borne a bruise for a book of names. At the edge of night, they marked an agreement. They would not shout in the forum. They would not call out the clerk with only anger. They would move with proof and witnesses. Lucia tied the ledger in a strip of linen and hid it under her shawl. Marcus touched the linen to reassure himself it was there. The ledger's weight was small but the meaning heavy. It turned the morning's cold oven into a document that might bring back warmth. A soft sound rose from the stair below, a careful knock. The rooftop fell silent and their breath paused. Marcus stood and peered toward the stair. He counted the knocks, 3 measured taps. Lucia moved her hand to the ledger and tightened her fingers until the cloth creased. Elias rose and cupped his ear. Marcus heard the knock again and named it aloud. "Who is there?" The chapter closed on that single repeated knock, and the two others waited for who would answer. The ledger had given them proof and made them visible. Marcus realized that having the ledger also opened a path to danger and to the possibility that neighbors might not be ready to act. He felt his pulse in the base of his throat and kept his shoulders set for motion. The knock might bring a friend or an enemy. They paused together, each ready to step into whatever came next. Lucia forced the clerk's narrow door. The ledger tumbled from the table and a loose receipt slid across the floor. Suspicion tightened her chest as flour dust settled on the ledger's leather spine. She crouched, fingers brushing inked names and a column of small marks, and the pre-dawn light showed a repeated notation beside one wealthy household. Marcus pressed his shoulder to the jam and whispered, "Look here." Lucia bent to see the circling mark and let the idea of theft swell into a decision. She had felt suspicion before, the cold oven the day before still in her mind where loaves had gone missing and the baker's hands had been empty. That memory kept her moving now. She did not wait for certainty. Lucia opened the ledger flat and turned the pages with careful, flour-dusted thumbs, tracing dates and amounts by touch as much as sight. A rustle from the stair told her Marcus had found a drawer with receipts tied in a thin cord. Marcus spoke without turning the page. "This is wrong." "Receipts with our mark, then this seal." His voice was low and quick. Lucia answered with a single sentence, "Who benefits?" She folded the ledger toward the light and read names aloud. They were not quiet in the way of people hiding from guilt. Their movements were taut, efficient. Marcus removed a folded scrap and held it between forefinger and thumb. "A servant's signature, then this official seal," he said. Lucia watched him. His jaw worked once. His hands trembled the fraction of a breath before he steadied them. Elias arrived on the landing with a slow step, shawl wrapped tight, his palms empty but his eyes alert. He leaned over the ledger and tapped a line with one thin finger. "This mark was not made by the clerk," he said. Lucia felt a new emotion press along the edge of her suspicion, doubt about what she had expected. She had come expecting a single selfish man. Now the ledger hinted at a pressure from above. The doubt pushed her to look for evidence rather than to accuse. They left the ledger on the landing and followed a torn scrap of linen caught on a nail at the top stair. The scrap matched the clay amulet thread Lucia always kept under her shawl, and the trail led them down into a narrow courtyard where shadows sat between crates and a servant's heavy steps had flattened dust. Lucia kept her hands free and her voice low. "Quiet," she said. Marcus followed. Elias moved with his cane but did not slow. Outside, a small courtyard door stood half open. Marcus peered through and saw attendants slipping a sack through a back gate into a wealthy doorway. Lucia crouched behind a low bench, breath even. The attendants did not look like thieves in a hurry. They moved with the practiced care of people who had done this before. Marcus counted aloud, his thumb tapping his index finger in the habitual way he measured coins. A young attendant lifted the sack with both hands and eased it toward the wealthy doorway. Lucia's pulse quickened into anger. She stepped forward and said the first name she could find in a clear voice, "Stop." "That's ours." The words cut the courtyard. The attendants froze. One of them glanced toward the gate and then back at the doorway. A tense exchange followed without long words. Marcus. Lucia hissed, "Don't pull," yet he crouched and folded his hands behind his back, an old habit when thinking. The attendant swallowed and spoke to the other in quick Latin that Lucia could only follow by gesture. The sack shifted. Marcus' jaw clicked. "You need proof," he muttered. They trailed the attendants by staying off the main path, shadowing the gate until the sack vanished through an inner threshold. Marcus found a torn piece of clay near a drain, matching the thread Lucia had earlier noticed on the torn cloth. The found shard tied the sack to a favored household. Lucia's anger cooled into clarity. Her earlier suspicion had become evidence. They returned to the bakery, where the oven had been cold the morning before. The baker scrubbed his hands at the sink, as if the action could erase the missing heat, and the empty table of loaves. Lucia grabbed his sleeve of the ledger marks "Deliveries missing," and I followed the trail, she said. The baker's face compressed. The confrontation in the soot-darkened kitchen began in rapid lines. "You took loaves." Lucia demanded he kept the family through winter. The baker replied, voice raw, "Me boy is ill." "I thought you thought for yourself, Marcus, and not for the line outside your stall." He stepped close enough that the baker's apron creased. The baker's shoulders dropped. "The clerk pressed me. He says we must make favors or lose our licenses." I tried to hide it. Elias turned a small clay cup in his hand and tapped it once on the table. The accusation bent the kitchen into another problem. Lucia's anger had shifted into a cold resolve to understand who was coercing the clerk. She put her palm flat on the baker's worktable and read receipts pinned under weights. "Where did the clerk go after the last delivery?" she asked. The baker pointed to the ledger and then to a name that repeated with an unfamiliar seal. Elias examined the seal closely and said, "This is not the clerk's hand. Someone forged it to look official." He rubbed his knuckles along a torn corner and pinched the edge of a receipt between fingers that were slower than they used to be but steady in judgment. That moment, the story shifted again. The blame could not sit merely on a greedy baker. It might be a watchman coerced by an official. Lucia felt her moral certainty tilt, and she put both hands to her mouth for a brief second before speaking. "Then we find the watchman who signed this, and we ask why." Marcus nodded. They moved together with a plan, small and careful. At dusk they climbed to the rooftops with sacks improvised into a shared table. Neighbors lit a single oil lamp and sat close. Marcus carried a frayed tool pouch. Lucia brought a small loaf, and the ledger hidden beneath her shawl. Elias settled with his thin wool shawl about his shoulders and tapped his cup once, as though arranging the room. Their voices were low and precise. Lucia read aloud the ledger entries that mattered, showing names and marks by the oil lamp. The neighbors listened. The rhythm of their breaths rose and fell with each new line. Marcus folded his hands and counted under his breath. Elias kept speaking in short sentences about seals and signatures. The group decided to confront the clerk directly when he returned that night with attendants. The rooftop meeting held a simple plan: watch the clerk's movements, catch the sacks, and decide whether to expose the clerk or to recover bread for the hungry first. Lucia's suspicion had given way to a steady calculation. She felt a protective impatience. When the sounds of feet creaked on the terrace below, everyone tightened. Late, under a sky as clear as stone, the clerk and two attendants moved with sacks gliding between them. The clerk carried a lamp, not bright, but enough to show badges on their shoulders. Elias tapped his cup and stood. "No," he said. The rooftop became a place of motion. Marcus vaulted to the parapet first, the leather of his belt whispering. He reached for the ledger and the clerk lunged toward him. Hands collided above sacks, spilling across the tiles. Lucia moved toward the nearest sack and pulled at the tied cords. The clerk swore and swung at Marcus. The clerk's lunge brought a brief burst of violence. Marcus countered by grabbing the clerk's wrist. "Marcus!" Lucia cried, and her voice cut sharp and clear. The clerk twisted and stumbled. The ledger fell from Marcus' grip and slid near the oil lamp. One attendant scrambled to shield the clerk, shouting a name to draw neighbors below. A rapid exchange followed on the roof. "Let go of him." The clerk barked. "No." Marcus answered, "This is our bread." Lucia have no proof. The clerk snarled, "Have this ledger, Elias." And he pointed with a finger that had steadiness left to it. 3 lines of accusation moved between them, short words, each carrying weight. Then someone tried to lift a sack and it ripped, bread tumbling like small, heavy stones across the tiles. Lucia caught a loaf as it rolled and pushed it toward the roof's edge where neighbors waited below. The physical motion of scattering bread changed the argument into action. In the scramble, Marcus lunged for the clerk again and wrestled him toward the low parapet. The clerk swung and caught Marcus' arm. Marcus' tool bag hit the tiles and tools clattered. The ledger lay open under the lamp. Pages fluttered. Lucia reached and stabbed a finger on a page, bringing up a name she had not expected to find. Her finger paused on a forged mark with an unfamiliar seal alias, she said, her throat gone thin with sudden realization this seal is newer than the clerk's ink. It's a city mark. Elias bent and studied the ink, his face narrowing. It's a mark the watch uses when an official orders redistribution. He said, but this stamp bears a cutter's notch I have not seen. Someone made it look like an order. His voice had an edge. He put the ledger under his arm as if he could protect it from the night. The rooftop fight reached its peak when Marcus finally rested the clerk down toward the tiles, and the clerk's lamp smashed. The light blown out, the attendant cursed in the dark, and sacks slithered across stone. Lucia had a choice in that moment, to force public shame on the clerk or to throw the spilled loaves down to the waiting neighbors. She moved instead toward the loaves. Her hands were steady as she gathered bread and handed it down. Take these, she said to a neighbor who crouched below, arms outstretched. Marcus, breath heavy, locked eyes with the clerk and said nothing. The clerk was left on his knees, chest heaving in the lamp's fractured light. After the scuffle, the rooftop fell into a rigid quiet. The clerk and attendants had fled when neighbors below shouted they would call the watch, but the ledger remained. Elias arranged what was left of the sacks on an upturned crate and began to divvy out bread to those who had nothing. His motions were slow and careful. He measured hunger with a practiced hand. That was a turning moment. The immediate danger receded, and the community took action, rather than waiting for a verdict. Lucia watched Marcus wipe stone dust on his sleeve and then sit beside Elias. Marcus' jaw relaxed as he handed a piece of bread to a child who had climbed up to the roof. The act of giving steadied Marcus more than any argument could. They sat in pairs, trading short lines about what to do next. "You must fix the ledger." Marcus shied it for now. Lucia answered, "If we present it to the magistrate, the official will only deny and punish. We need witnesses and safety." Elias tapped his cup 3 times and nodded. "You will be watchers." He said, "We'll watch who moves the orders and who keeps the seals." The moral shape of the betrayal had shifted once more. What began as suspected cruelty by a baker became a web of coercion reaching into the civic seal. Lucia's suspicion had transitioned to anger, then to doubt, and now to a quiet resolve to protect the community. She folded the ledger close and pressed it to her chest beneath her shawl. At dawn, Lucia walked alone through the empty cobbled alley to the bakery. The oven was warm now. Someone had put coals to it during the night. The baker met her at the door, eyes red and hands raw from kneading. He did not offer excuses this time. He held up a clay cup in both hands. He couldn't keep it up anymore. He said when they demanded more. "I could not give it." Lucia reached into her shawl and set the ledger on the counter between them. She pushed a small loaf forward and said, "We gave what we could last night. We'll keep watch and share, but you must not hide receipts again. If you are forced, tell us." Her voice was tired but steady. Marcus came then, boots scraping cobbles, and Elias followed. "Shall ask you." They formed a small line of witnesses. The baker looked at each of them, and then at the ledger. He touched the pages with a single fingertip and looked away. "If it is a forged seal," he said, "I will tell whoever listens. I was afraid of losing my oven, my license. I was afraid of my boy's fever." Lucia listened and then said, "Fear and bread do not excuse secrecy. But fear explains why you bowed. We will watch for the seal's maker, and for the watchman who signed under pressure." Marcus added, "We will not burn a man for being frightened. We will root out who makes them afraid." Their exchanges were short and practical. The argument shaped into a plan. They decided to hide the ledger in the baker's oven box, wrapped in cloth, until they had enough witness accounts to approach an honest scribe. Elias wrote 2 names on a scrap and tucked them into his pouch. "We will not expose every thief to the magistrate at once," he said. "We will gather proof. We will protect the hungry first." Lucia agreed, and tied a scrap of red thread to the ledger's cloth as a marker. The next days were measured in small actions. Marcus watched the clerks wrote and counted attendance. Lucia kept morning watch at the bakery door and noted who came in with baskets. Elias made quiet visits to other rooftops and listened for talk of seals and favors. They collected details: a new wax stamp traded for a lamb here, an official's messenger seen entering the same wealthy doorway there. Each discovery felt like another stitch in a net. Tension rose again when a neighbor recognized the clerk's attendant at the market with a satchel of receipts. Lucia and Marcus followed and confronted the attendant in the vendor's row. The attendant denied it until the vendor showed a torn scrap, matching the ledger's thread. The attendant's face paled, and he blurted a name, a low-level official known for collecting bribes. That revelation changed the immediate plan. Marcus' suspicion hardened into determination, and he wanted to drag the official into the square and demand a hearing. Lucia held him back with a single sentence: "We need witnesses who will stand with us. If we force him without proof, he will only point to stronger hands above him." Marcus ground his teeth, but gave way. Instead, they moved to protect neighbors who would be most exposed if the official retaliated. Lucia put a small loaf into the hands of the baker's boy and told him to take it to the woman at the alley with the coughing husband. She gave direct instructions and did not ask permission. Action calmed her. It let the villagers see that something could be done without magistrates. The next surprise came from an unexpected place. A clerk from a nearby warehouse knocked at the bakery one morning and asked to speak with Lucia alone. He wore a plain tunic and smelled faintly of oil. He whispered a note folded in his palm, a list of deliveries redirected and a name crossed out with a shaky hand. He begged for a small loaf and then left without waiting for thanks. That scrap was the twist, an insider willing to risk his position to hand over evidence. Lucia put the scrap into the ledger's cloth and then looked at Marcus. They both realized the scale had been larger than any of them had thought. The ledger was not only a list, but a map of favors paid and seals forged. The community had been bypassed by systematic corruption. They convened a small roof meeting with neighbors who had nothing to lose, and those who were willing to testify. Voices rose and fell in short lines. Saw the sacks. One neighbor said, "He can swear I heard the official's messenger 2 nights ago. I saw the attendant at the market." Another added. Marcus counted names and nods. Elias, as ever, listened and tapped his cup before speaking. A plan formed that was careful and public: gather sworn neighbors, confront the low official in the square, and show the ledger to a magistrate known to keep his own hands clean. Lucia felt the final emotion shift, take shape: resolve coupled with a wary hope that came from practical steps rather than belief in kindness. She knew the risks. She had watched the clerk's lamp smash and the attendants flee. Still, to do nothing felt worse. When they presented the ledger to the magistrate's scribe, they did not do so with shouts. They moved as a group, ledger wrapped and witness list ready. The magistrate's clerk took the pages, examined the seals under a small candle, and then sent a runner to fetch the official named on the market scrap. The official arrived with a retinue and a look of practiced surprise. Confrontation in the magistrate's hall was short and sharp. Marcus spoke first and named theft and coercion. The official denied and pointed to legal forms. Lucia placed the ledger on the table and opened to the page with the forged city mark. Elias tapped the page and said plainly, "This is forged." "The seal is not the watch." As the official's face tightened. He barked in order, and a guard moved to seize the ledger. Marcus stood and blocked him with a single step. "Do not touch it," he said. The magistrate, who had been silent, looked between the men and then asked for witnesses. Neighbors stepped forward one by one and said what they had seen. The clerk's assistant from the market gave his name and placed his hand on the table. Under the pressure of witnesses and inked ledgers, the official's mask slipped. He called for a hearing, but the magistrate insisted on immediate detainment of the clerk and the attendants for questioning while the matter was investigated. Those arrests were not dramatic. They were a civic motion that moved the ledger from private proof into public record. Back on the rooftops that night, the neighborhood gathered in a cautious way. The official might return, or a new complication might arise. They shared what remained of the sacks and counted who needed extra flour. Lucia sat with the ledger hidden beneath her shawl and felt the last loose thread of doubt snap into something like closure. Elias organized the distribution quietly and gave small clay cups to the most in need. Marcus clapped a child's shoulder and said nothing. The baker, once cowed, now kneaded loaves openly by the oven, and neighbors took turns standing guard at his door. The ledger had been used to bring a civic response, not to create public shame alone. Lucia made a choice that evening. The ledger could be turned into the magistrate permanently, or kept in the neighborhood's hands as a record to protect them against retaliation. She called Marcus and Elias close and said, "We will keep it here for now. We will give copies and names to the scribe, but the original stays with those who need it." Marcus hesitated and then nodded. Elias tapped his cup twice and agreed. They wrapped the ledger and put it in the baker's oven box, where the warmth of the coals would keep it dry. Lucia slid a small loaf above it as a marker. Then she stepped out into the alley with Marcus and Elias and watched neighbors move like lives resettling into order. There was no grand speech, no sudden closure. There were small acts, someone sweeping a step, someone handing a child bread, someone laughing at a small joke Marcus made. The final morning came with concrete consequence. A runner from the magistrate arrived with a paper list of names to call for questioning and an order to inspect official seals across the district. The clerk and attendants were in custody, and their statements would be taken. The low official had been suspended pending inquiry. Lucia did not celebrate. She set a loaf at the oven's door and went to the rooftop with Marcus and Elias. They stood together and watched the sun lift over tiled roofs. Lucia placed the ledger's wrapped cloth into Elias' small pouch for safe keeping while they gave copies to the magistrate's clerk. She felt a steady, worn relief rather than triumph. The ledger's truth had forced choices: to expose, to protect, to feed. Each decision had been a stitch in the neighborhood's fragile safety net. Elias murmured, "We will watch the watchman now." Marcus grunted and then said, "And we will eat when there is bread." Lucia smiled without words. She slipped the small clay amulet she kept under her shawl into the ledger wrap as a quiet safeguard. They left the roof together. Below, neighbors were already forming a line at the baker's stall. Lucia moved through them, handing the first loaf to a woman whose hands trembled. The ledger's presence shifted the shape of their days. It would never fix hunger entirely, but it had forced an accounting. As the sun rose higher, Lucia folded her apron and smoothed down the cloth. The bakery's oven gave a steady heat now, and people spoke in short sentences: plans for watching, names to note, times to stand at the gate. Elias remained on the rooftop with a clay cup. Marcus returned to his tools, and Lucia stood at the counter and turned the ledger's worn pages once more before closing it. The chapter closed not on a proclamation but on an action, Lucia sliding the ledger into the oven box, setting the small loaf atop it, and turning the key on the latch of the baker's door. The lock clicked, the oven's coals hissed, and footsteps carried neighbors back to their routines with a new watchfulness. This was not the end of need or of corruption, but it was the end of a night when the neighborhood had allowed bread to be taken without answer. Lucia's hands were flour-scarred as she set the latch. She looked up at Marcus and Elias and nodded once, a promise measured in work and quiet vigilance.